July 1940, Kaunas, Lithuania. At dawn, the narrow cobblestone streets were filled with quiet footsteps, not of soldiers, but of families carrying suitcases that looked too heavy for their thin arms. Mothers clutched children whose eyes had already seen too much. Fathers walked silently, faces hollowed by fear and exhaustion. They were running out of time, and they knew it. Rumors had spread like wildfire across the refugee circles. "There's a Japanese consul. He's giving out visas. He's helping people escape." No one quite believed it. Japan was an ally of Germany. Helping Jews was dangerous, suicidal even. But desperation doesn't weigh logic. And so, as the morning light broke across the city, a line began forming outside the gates of the Japanese consulate. Hundreds of refugees praying the rumor was true. Inside, Vice Consul Chiune Sugihara sat at his desk, his fountain pen trembling between ink and conscience. Telegrams from Tokyo lay scattered across his table, each stamped with the same message: "Do not issue visas without proper authorization." He had read those words dozens of times, each one feeling heavier than the last. Outside his window, the sound of pleading voices grew louder. He looked up and saw them. Men in ragged coats holding worn passports, mothers whispering prayers as they clutched their children's shoulders, faces pale with hunger and fear, eyes searching for a miracle. And then through the crowd, he saw one little boy. The child was maybe 8, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame. He held his mother's hand tightly, whispering something Sugihara couldn't hear, but he didn't need to. The look in the boy's eyes said everything. That mixture of terror and fragile hope only a child could hold. Sugihara stood, walked slowly to the window, and for a long moment just watched them. His wife, Yukiko, appeared at the doorway. "Chiune," she said softly, "Tokyo has sent another cable." He didn't turn. "I know," he whispered. "They've made themselves clear." He returned to his desk, hands trembling. His duty was to obey. His orders were explicit. But outside, the line kept growing, a river of human desperation winding down the street. And at that moment, duty and humanity collided inside him. He dipped his pen in ink. The first stroke of his handwriting trembled, then steadied. Transit visa through Japan. He stamped it, signed it, and handed it to the first man in line. The refugee stared at the paper like it was gold. Then his knees buckled. He wept, loud, uncontrolled sobs that echoed through the consulate hallway. His wife collapsed beside him, clutching the visa to her chest. "We can live. We can live," she whispered over and over. Outside, the crowd began to stir. Word spread faster than wind. "He's giving visas. The Japanese consul is saving people." Dozens rushed forward, tears streaming down their faces. The gate guards couldn't contain them. Sugihara didn't stop. He kept signing. 1, 2, 10, 20. The ink began to dry and he redipped the pen. His fingers cramped. His eyes burned, but he refused to stop. In that small consulate, history was being rewritten by a man defying his own empire. Each signature became a lifeline, a fragile bridge between death and survival. And as the line outside grew longer, one thought filled the air like a prayer whispered by thousands: "May he not stop before it's my turn." By midday, the narrow street outside the Japanese consulate had transformed into a human sea. Refugees stretched as far as the eye could see, families from Poland, Lithuania, Germany, Czechoslovakia, all clinging to the same fragile hope that one man might save them. The July sun beat down mercilessly, but no one moved. They'd waited through worse: bombings, deportations, betrayal. Waiting now meant survival. Inside, Chiune Sugihara had abandoned every formality of diplomacy. The once tidy office was a storm of paper, stamps, ink bottles, and passports stacked in uneven towers. The air smelled of sweat and old leather. Every time the door opened, it carried with it the sound of muffled crying, part relief, part desperation. His wife Yukiko silently refilled the inkwell and blotted his signature pages to keep them from smearing. The consul's hand trembled as he wrote, but his rhythm never broke. Each visa took time, The name, the family members, the destination, the official seal, the transit approval through Japan. Hours passed. His fingers grew stained black with ink. His wrist ached, but he refused to pause. At the window, a group of children pressed their faces against the glass. A little girl, her hair tangled and her dress faded, whispered to her brother, "Do you think he'll help us?" The boy, barely older, nodded without conviction. When Sugihara caught sight of them, something inside him hardened. "Bring them in," he told the guard quietly. Minutes later, the family stood before his desk. The mother couldn't speak. Her hands shook as she offered their papers. The children stood close, watching every movement. Sugihara looked up, his expression calm but his eyes filled with unspoken emotion. "You will go to Japan," he said softly. "From there, you will find a ship. You will live." The woman burst into tears. Her husband clasped Sugihara's hand and kissed it before the guards gently led them out. Outside, the crowd erupted, dozens crying, some falling to their knees, others pressing their hands together in prayer. They had seen the impossible, a Japanese official saving Jews in a world that had stopped saving them. From his office, Sugihara could hear it, the sound of hope returning to people who had forgotten what it felt like. But for every visa he signed, 10 more requests appeared. He knew he couldn't save them all. The thought cut through him like a knife. Still, he wrote faster. By nightfall, hundreds of documents lay drying across the room. His wife lit candles as darkness fell, their flames reflecting in the ink. "You can rest," she said softly. "Tomorrow there will be more." Sugihara leaned back, eyes heavy, and looked out the window one last time. The street was still full, hundreds still waiting, children asleep against their mothers' laps, passports clutched to their chests like holy relics. He whispered to himself, "I'll write until I can't." And then he picked up the pen again. To understand the magnitude of what Shune Sugihara was doing, one has to understand the world that surrounded him. A world collapsing under the weight of war, fear, and blind obedience. It was the summer of 1940, and Europe was burning. The Nazi army had already swallowed Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France. Across the continent, Jewish families were being rounded up, marked, and stripped of their rights. Rumors of mass killings were spreading like poison, though few could yet imagine the true scale of what was coming. For the Jews trapped between Nazi-occupied Poland and the tightening borders of the Soviet Union, there was nowhere left to run. Lithuania, once a quiet refuge, had fallen under Soviet control. Refugees who fled the Nazis now found themselves trapped by the communists, and soon, even that small window would close. The Soviets were preparing to deport anyone without proper visas, which meant that the thousands of Jews in Kaunas were facing a slow, certain death. In that chaos, the Japanese consulate stood as one of the last functioning diplomatic offices still issuing travel documents. Japan, at that moment, was aligned with Nazi Germany under the Tripartite Pact. Tokyo's orders were clear: no assistance to Jewish refugees. The Japanese government wanted to avoid angering its new ally, and diplomats were expected to comply without question. But Chiune Sugihara was not a man who followed orders blindly. Born in 1900, the son of a humble samurai family, he had been raised with a sense of duty that went beyond politics. He spoke Russian fluently, had studied in Harbin, and understood the deep fear of those fleeing Soviet repression. Yet now, sitting in that small consulate office, he was being asked to choose between his career and his conscience. Telegram after telegram came from Tokyo, stamped with the same command: no visas to be issued without proper documentation or destination. But what documentation could a refugee running from death possibly have? They carried no papers, no sponsors, only trembling hands and the fading hope of escape. Sugihara knew the bureaucratic rules were designed to deny them. If he followed them, every person outside his gates would die. He discussed it with his wife for hours, walking in silence through the dim rooms of their rented home. "If I disobey," he said, "I'll lose everything. My position, my honor, maybe our future." Yukiko looked at him and whispered, "If you obey, they'll lose their lives." That night, he made his decision. When the morning came, he sent one final telegram to Tokyo. I request permission to issue visas to Jewish refugees for humanitarian reasons. The reply came swiftly. Permission denied. He read the words, folded the paper, and placed it in his drawer. Then he picked up his pen and continued writing. From that day forward, the consulate became a lifeline. Refugees who had nowhere to go could now cross through the Soviet Union to Japan, and then find passage to Shanghai, Canada, or the United States. All they needed was one signature, his. And with each visa, Sugihara was gambling everything. The Japanese Foreign Ministry was watching. The Germans had spies everywhere. If discovered, he could be recalled, court-martialed, even imprisoned. Yet none of it stopped him. He wrote for hours each day, sometimes 16, 18 hours at a time. He signed so many documents that his wrist began to swell, his fingers going numb from exhaustion. His aides warned him. Other diplomats avoided his office. Some whispered that he had lost his mind. But every morning, when he opened the curtains and saw the endless line of faces outside, the doubt vanished. If I can save even one life, he told his wife, it will be worth it. By mid-August, his actions were no longer a secret. The Soviet authorities, alarmed by the flood of refugees using Japanese visas, began pressuring him to stop. Tokyo sent another cable, colder than the last. Cease issuing visas immediately. You are exceeding your authority. He ignored it. When the Soviet Union ordered the closure of the Japanese consulate, Sugihara refused to leave. For 10 more days he stayed behind, issuing as many visas as he could. His wife brought him meals at his desk, though he barely ate. The sound of his pen scratching across paper became a rhythm of defiance, steady, relentless, unstoppable. As the deadline approached, refugees began to panic. The trains were scheduled to leave, and many still had no papers. Sugihara moved into the hotel near the station, setting up a temporary desk on his balcony. Even as the evacuation trains prepared to depart, he kept writing. Passengers boarded with tears streaming down their faces, clutching their precious visas, each one a fragile miracle written in Japanese ink. It was said that when the final whistle blew and the train began to move, Chune Sugihara leaned out of the window and kept signing documents, tossing stamped papers into the hands of desperate refugees running alongside the tracks. He did not stop until the train disappeared into the distance, and by then, more than 6,000 lives had been saved. For the refugees clutching Sugihara's visas, the journey that followed was not an escape. It was a test of endurance, faith, and human will. The ink on their papers was barely dry when they began their passage eastward through Soviet territory. The route stretched thousands of miles by train, from Lithuania to Moscow, then to Vladivostok, and finally by ship to Japan. They carried everything they owned in small suitcases, and many carried even less, only the document bearing the consul's name. But that paper, signed in blue ink, was everything. It was life itself. Inside the crowded rail cars, families huddled together, whispering prayers over the small rectangles of hope. Mothers would unfold the visas again and again, tracing Sugihara's neat Japanese characters with trembling fingers, as if the ink itself held the power to keep them alive. The trains creaked across frozen landscapes, through nights without heat or food. People fainted from exhaustion. Some died along the way. And yet, for the first time in years, they were moving toward life instead of death. At each stop, Soviet guards inspected documents with suspicion. The refugees waited in silence, hearts pounding, until the officer's expression softened at the sight of the official Japanese seal. Then, a nod, permission to continue. Again and again, that single symbol opened doors that would otherwise have been sealed forever. Among them was a young rabbi from Warsaw, traveling with his wife and newborn son. The baby was too weak to cry, his tiny body wrapped in torn blankets. The rabbi later wrote, "Every time the train stopped, I thought it would be the end. But each time someone saw that visa, that miracle of ink and courage, and waved us on." When the refugees finally reached Japan, most arrived in the port city of Kobe. The locals, who had never seen such crowds of displaced European Jews, watched in quiet awe as these pale, exhausted travelers stepped off the ships. Their clothes hung loose, their faces hollowed by hunger, yet their eyes burned with gratitude. Japanese families, moved by compassion, shared food and blankets. Local synagogues opened their doors. For the first time in months, these men, women, and children slept without fear of a midnight knock. They ate rice and fish instead of scraps. They prayed not for survival, but in thanksgiving. Many refugees continued on to Shanghai, where they survived the rest of the war in a Jewish ghetto established under Japanese oversight. Conditions were harsh, but compared to the horrors consuming Europe, it was salvation. Years later, survivors would look back and realize every life in that ghetto, every child who grew up to see peace, was part of Sugihara's legacy. But not everyone made it. Some refugees reached the Soviet border too late. When Sugihara was finally forced to close his consulate, hundreds were still waiting in line. They fell to their knees as the doors shut, crying his name, begging for one more signature. Witnesses said Sugihara looked out from the balcony of his hotel, tears in his eyes, as the line slowly dissolved into despair. He had done everything he could, and more than anyone ever dared. For those who made it through, his name became sacred. Parents taught their children, "A Japanese man saved us," and those children grew up, telling their children the same. A piece of paper, a stroke of ink. That was all it took to divide the living from the dead. And one man, sitting in a small consulate in Kaunas, had given that miracle 6,000 times. When the order to leave Lithuania finally arrived, it came with the cold precision of bureaucracy. The Japanese government had recalled Chiune Sugihara to Berlin, effective immediately. His mission in Kaunas was over. The consulate was to be closed, the flag lowered, and the files secured. But Sugihara was not finished. For weeks he had ignored Tokyo's commands, risking not only his career but the safety of his entire family. He had been warned repeatedly. His superiors' letters became sharper, their tone less diplomatic and more like threats. They reminded him that Japan was now a formal ally of Nazi Germany. Any action that angered Berlin could be seen as disloyalty to the empire. Still, he wrote, still he signed, still he refused to stop. On the final morning in Kaunas, the consulate was nearly empty. Boxes were stacked by the door, the walls stripped of their official portraits. The line of refugees outside, however, remained endless. They stood in silence, eyes pleading through the barred gate, knowing this was their last chance. Sugihara stood at his desk, surrounded by half-filled forms, his suit wrinkled and ink-stained. His wife, Yukiko, gently massaged his swollen hand, the tendons tight and throbbing. "You've done enough," she whispered. "If you keep going, you'll break your hand." He looked at her, exhaustion etched deep into his face, and said softly, "If my hand stops, so will their lives." He dipped his pen once more and continued writing. Outside, people wept openly as their names were called. Each received the stamped visa like a holy relic, bowing, crying, thanking him in every language they knew: Polish, Yiddish, Russian, German. Some kissed the floor of the consulate before leaving. By the time the car arrived to take the family to the station, he had written over 2,000 visas, each often covering entire families. He hadn't slept properly in days. His hands shook uncontrollably, but he refused to let the pen fall. At the train station, chaos reigned. Refugees swarmed around the platform, shouting, begging, reaching through windows to hand him their papers. Sugihara stood on the steps of the departing train, still signing documents as the whistle screamed. His wife held the ink bottle steady while he scrawled signatures against the wall of the carriage. Witnesses remembered the sight. A man, already under orders to stop, refusing to obey until the very last moment. As the train began to move, refugees ran alongside it, holding out their passports, their hands, their hope. Sugihara leaned out of the window, stamping and signing, until the train gathered speed. He threw finished visas into the crowd, shouting in Japanese, "Good luck, please live, please live." He didn't stop until the papers ran out, and then, with a trembling hand, he bowed deeply to the people left on the platform. The refugees bowed back, hundreds of them crying, their voices breaking through the sound of the departing train. In that moment, a diplomat became something far greater than his title. He had defied his empire, violated his orders, and risked everything for strangers whose only common bond was that they were human beings in need. The Japanese government would later strip him of his position. He would lose his career, his status, his pension. For years he lived in quiet obscurity, working menial jobs just to feed his family. But among those he saved, his name became legend. They called him the Japanese Schindler, a man who obeyed his conscience when the world obeyed fear. When the train carrying Chiune Sugihara and his family finally crossed out of Lithuania, silence fell inside the cabin. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel was the only sound. His wife sat beside him, their children asleep in her lap. Sugihara's right hand was bandaged, the tendons swollen, his knuckles raw from weeks of non-stop writing. He stared out the window, the countryside blurring past, his reflection pale against the glass. For the first time in months, he was not writing. And that silence felt heavier than any command Tokyo had ever sent. He knew what awaited him. The foreign ministry would not forgive this. Japan was now deep in alliance with Nazi Germany, a relationship that demanded loyalty, not mercy. By the time he arrived at his next post, the reprimand had already been written. Officially, the reason for his dismissal was reduction of staff. Unofficially, everyone knew why. He had disobeyed orders. He had embarrassed the empire. He had chosen compassion over command. After the war, when Japan surrendered and its embassies collapsed across Asia, Sugihara's career ended quietly, without ceremony. The man who had once worn the crisp uniform of a diplomat found himself unemployed, selling light bulbs door to door to feed his family. At times he worked as a translator, then later for a small company trading with Eastern Europe. He never spoke of what he had done in Lithuania, not to boast, not even to defend himself. When his children asked why he'd lost his job, he simply said, "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything." For years, he lived in obscurity, his story buried beneath the rubble of war and politics. Japan was rebuilding, and few cared to remember a diplomat who had broken ranks to save Jews. But across the world, the people he had saved were not silent. In Israel, survivors built new lives. They married, had children, and told them the same story, about a Japanese man in a small office who had given them a visa, a chance, a future. They called him a righteous soul, and they searched for him. In 1968, one of them, Yehoshua Nishri, now an Israeli diplomat, finally found Sugihara living in a modest apartment in Tokyo. When he knocked on the door, the aging consul was stunned. "You are alive," Sugihara whispered. "Because of you," Nishri replied. "I have children." Word spread. Letters began arriving from all over the world, testimonies, thank you notes, photos of families who owed their existence to him. Thousands of descendants, thousands of lives born from those 6,000 visas. In 1985, the Israeli government honored him with the title Righteous Among the Nations, the highest award given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. He became the only Japanese citizen ever to receive it. Too weak to travel, his wife and son went in his place. They planted a tree in his name at Yad Vashem, the memorial of Holocaust martyrs and heroes, where it still stands today, its roots deep in Israeli soil, its branches reaching toward heaven. When reporters later asked him why he had done it, Sugihara gave no speech, no philosophy, no moral lecture. He simply said, "They were human beings. I had to do something." That was his entire explanation, and his eternal legacy. The story of Chiune Sugihara did not end with his dismissal. It lived quietly in the shadows for decades, in letters passed from parent to child, in stories told across dinner tables in Tel Aviv, Warsaw, New York, and Jerusalem. Families who had been nothing more than names on a desperate list now carried his signature in their bloodlines. For years, no one in Japan spoke of him. His name didn't appear in textbooks, no statues bore his likeness, and even his neighbors had no idea that the quiet man living down the street had once saved thousands from the Holocaust. He went to work, came home, read to his children, and prayed in silence that the people he had signed for were still alive somewhere. Then slowly, letters began to arrive, first a handful, then hundreds. Survivors tracked him down one by one. They sent him photos of weddings, graduations, grandchildren. Each envelope was a living testament. One man wrote, "My family of 4 now numbers 23. Because of you, we all exist." Another enclosed a photograph of a newborn baby and said, "This is your child too." By the time the world finally recognized him, Sugihara was an old man, frail and nearly blind. He never asked for recognition, never claimed heroism. When an interviewer pressed him for his reasoning, he simply said, "I did what I believed was right." In 1985, when the State of Israel declared him righteous among the nations, his surviving family traveled to Jerusalem. There, beneath a bright Mediterranean sun, they watched as a tree was planted in his honor along the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. On its bronze plaque was a single name, Chiune Sugihara, Japan. As the soil was pressed around the roots, an elderly survivor approached Yukiko Sugihara and took her hand. Tears rolled down his face. "I was there," he whispered. "I was at the gate in Kaunas. Your husband saved me." He pointed to a small child beside him. "And this is my grandson. He exists because your husband disobeyed orders." For a moment, Yukiko could not speak. The weight of those words, 40 years of silence, sacrifice, and redemption, rested in her trembling hands. Back in Japan, recognition slowly followed. Schools began teaching his story. Documentaries were made. In the small town of Yaotsu, where he was born, a museum now stands filled with the names of those he saved. And among Jewish communities worldwide, he is remembered each year not as a diplomat, but as a man who refused to let obedience replace conscience. His act was not a grand speech nor a battlefield victory. It was a pen, a hand, and the courage to keep writing when everyone else stopped. He signed his name 6,000 times, and in doing so, signed his defiance against evil. Today, more than 80 years later, the descendants of those visas number in the tens of thousands. They are doctors, teachers, artists, parents, living memorials to one man's impossible choice. And somewhere in the archives of history, his ink still speaks. A reminder that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers across time, in the quiet stroke of a pen, in the trembling hand of a man who chose humanity over orders, and in the lives that continue to breathe because he dared to write. In a century defined by obedience and fear, one man chose the quiet rebellion of compassion. Chiune Sugihara never carried a weapon, never commanded an army, and never sought glory. Yet with a pen and a trembling hand, he fought a different kind of war, one against indifference. Every visa he signed was a candle lit in the darkness of humanity's worst hour. And those flames still burn today, in the laughter of children, in the stories told at dinner tables, in every heartbeat that exists, because he refused to turn away. His courage reminds us that history isn't only written by the powerful. Sometimes it's rewritten by those who simply refuse to be silent. So as you close this story, take a moment to remember that even the smallest act of conscience can echo for generations. If this story moved you, leave a like to let it travel further, and subscribe to keep these forgotten voices alive. Because somewhere, hidden in the pages of history, there are still heroes whose names the world has yet to remember, and it's up to us to keep their light from fading.